Picture this. It is the first week of July in 1945. The rubble of Berlin is still smoking from the apocalyptic street fighting of the previous months. American GIs and Soviets and Soviet Army soldiers are sharing cigarettes and drinking vodka on the banks of the Elbe River, celebrating the total destruction of the Nazi war machine. The world is breathing a collective sigh of relief. But beneath the smiles and the diplomatic handshakes, the geopolitical tectonic plates are grinding against each other. What if the order came down from Moscow, not to halt and consolidate, but to keep marching west? What if Joseph Stalin decided that the English Channel, not the Elbe, was the natural border of the Soviet Empire? Today, we are wargaming the ultimate nightmare scenario of the 20th century. We are looking at a full-scale Soviet invasion of Western Europe in the summer of 1945, analyzing the tactics, the armor, the logistics, and the sheer brutality of a conflict that would have dwarfed everything that came before it. Before we cross the line of departure and dive into the operational maps, I need you to sound off in the comments. I want to know who you are betting your life on in a head-to-head armored duel in 1945, the American M26 Pershing or the Soviet IS-2 heavy tank. Put your tactical reasoning down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing from us. We rely on veterans, military analysts, and history buffs like you to keep this channel running and to keep these deep dive war games coming. To understand how a Soviet invasion of Western Europe could even be conceived, we have to strip away the warm and fuzzy propaganda of the Grand Alliance and look at the cold, hard calculus of Soviet paranoia. Stalin did not view the Western allies as permanent friends. He viewed them as temporary co-belligerents in a war of sheer survival. You have to rewind the clock to the end of the First World War to understand his mindset. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the United States, Britain, and France actually sent expeditionary forces into Russia to fight the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. The American Polar Bear expedition fought in the frozen hellscape of Archangel, shedding Russian blood. Stalin never forgot that intervention. He was absolutely convinced that the capitalist West would eventually try to strangle the Soviet Union again. Fast forward to the summer of 1945, and the Soviet Union had just lost 27 million people. Their industrial heartland was a graveyard of twisted metal and ash. For Stalin, national security meant physical space. It meant a territorial buffer zone so incredibly deep that no Western army could ever reach Moscow again. He looked at the strategic map of Europe and saw a massive power vacuum. The British Empire was practically bankrupt and bleeding out. The French military was a hollowed-out shadow of its former self, still trying to rebuild from the utter humiliation of 1940. And then there were the Americans. The Americans had their eyes fixed firmly on the Pacific Theater. The invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, was looming ominously on the horizon, promising up to 1 million American casualties. Stalin knew the American public was deeply war-weary. He knew Washington desperately wanted to bring the boys home. This creates a fascinating historical parallel to the American experience in the Vietnam War. Decades later, where overwhelming military supremacy on the battlefield can be completely undercut by a collapse of political will on the home front. Stalin calculated that if he struck hard and fast, pushing his tank armies to the Rhine River or even the Atlantic coast, the American public would simply not stomach a Third World War to liberate Paris a second time. Let us look at the order of battle, starting with the sheer mass of the Soviet Juggernaut. In July 1945, the Red Army was the most formidable and battle-hardened land force on the planet. We are talking about nearly 11 million men under arms. In the European theatre alone, they had over 300 divisions deployed and ready for combat. But do not let the raw numbers completely fool you. A Soviet rifle division in 1945 was often fighting at severely reduced strength, numbering maybe 5,000 men compared to a full-strength American infantry division of 14,000 men. However, what they lacked in individual riflemen, they made up for in sheer, unadulterated firepower and aggressive doctrine. The Soviet military machine was built entirely around the concept of deep battle. This was not about pushing the enemy back in a neat, orderly line. It was about violently rupturing the enemy's front at a specific focal point, pouring massive mechanized and armored corps through the gap and driving relentlessly into the rear to paralyze their logistics and command nodes. It is the exact same theoretical concept the Germans used with Blitzkrieg, but scaled up to a massive continental level that the Wehrmacht could never sustain. Leading this charge were the elite shock armies and the Guards tank armies. These formations were commanded by men who had survived the most brutal Darwinian selection process in military history. Men like Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev. They were ruthless, brilliant operational commanders who were perfectly willing to trade tens of thousands of their own men's lives for a single tactical advantage. They utilized penal battalions, known as Strafbat, forcing political prisoners and disgraced soldiers to march through active minefields just to clear a path for the armor. The armored fist of the Red Army was a terrifying prospect for any defending force. By 1945, the T-34-85 was the absolute backbone of their tank corps. It was rugged, mechanically simple enough to be repaired in the mud by a conscript with a wrench, and armed with an 85mm gun that could punch through most standard Western armor. But the real terror of the battlefield, the psychological weapon that kept Allied tank crews awake at night, was the IS-2 heavy tank. This monster weighed 46 tons and carried a massive 122mm main gun. To put that massive caliber in perspective, the standard American Sherman tank was mounting a 75mm or 76mm gun. The IS-2's gun was originally designed as a heavy field artillery piece. When it fired a high explosive or armor-piercing round, it could shatter the frontal glacis of a heavily armored German Panther tank at over a mile away. The kinetic energy transfer was so immense that even if the shell did not penetrate the armor, the resulting spalling which is the fragmentation of the armor plating inside the crew compartment, would instantly turn the enemy crew into hamburger meat. The IS-2 boasted up to 4.7 inches of sloped frontal armor, making it a rolling bunker. But it had a glaring, fatal weakness that American gunners would absolutely exploit. The 122mm ammunition was so massive and heavy that it required a two-piece loading system. This meant the heavy projectile and the separate propellant charge had to be loaded one after the other by the loader. This dropped the IS-2's rate of fire to a dismal 2 to 3 rounds per minute. In a fast-paced, close-quarters tank duel, where whoever shoots second dies first, that delay is an absolute death sentence. Supporting this armor was the Soviet Artillery Corps. Stalin famously called artillery the god of war, and he was not exaggerating his reliance on it. The Red Army artillery reserves were staggering in their scale. During a breakthrough operation, they could concentrate over 300 artillery tubes per mile of front. We are talking about massive batteries of 152mm howitzers and the infamous BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers. The Katyusha, known terrifyingly as Stalin's organ, fired a barrage of unguided rockets that could completely saturate a grid square in a matter of seconds. It was not precision fire by any stretch of the imagination. It was pure psychological warfare and area denial. The screaming, tearing sound of the rockets' incoming hum was enough to break the combat effectiveness of green troops before a single piece of shrapnel even hit the dirt. The Soviets would use a rolling barrage, a wall of high explosives moving steadily ahead of their advancing infantry, obliterating defensive lines and severing communication wires. But here is the critical flaw in the Soviet war machine, and it is a massive vulnerability that amateur military analysts often gloss over. Logistics. There is an old saying that amateurs talk tactics, but professionals talk logistics. The Red Army was largely tied to the rail network for its operational reach. Their truck fleet was massive, yes, but a huge percentage of it was provided by American Lend-Lease. The iconic American-made Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton truck was the literal workhorse of the Soviet supply lines. Over 400,000 American trucks kept the Red Army moving from Stalingrad all the way to Berlin. If Stalin suddenly attacked the West, that vital supply of spare parts, replacement tires, and high-octane aviation fuel would stop overnight. The Soviet logistical chain would immediately begin to cannibalize itself. Furthermore, the European rail network used standard gauge tracks. The Soviet Union, fearing invasion, had historically used a wider broad gauge for their trains. As the Red Army advanced west into Germany and France, they either had to tear up and relay thousands of miles of track, or manually transfer thousands of tons of cargo by hand at the border stations. This creates a massive, vulnerable logistical bottleneck. I ask you to consider the reality of mechanized warfare. You can have 10,000 heavy tanks, but if they run out of diesel fuel 30 miles past the Elbe River, they are just expensive, immobile pillboxes waiting to be bombed. Now, let us pivot to the Allied forces, the men standing in the mud between the Red Army and the English Channel. The combined American, British, Canadian, and French forces in Europe numbered roughly 4.5 million men. They had around 90 divisions in the theatre. On paper, if you just look at the raw numbers, they were massively outnumbered by the Soviet hordes. But this is exactly where you have to look past the spreadsheet and examine the qualitative differences. Every single American infantry division in 1945 was fully motorized. They had organic truck battalions, thousands of jeeps, and half-tracks assigned to them. The American Army at the end of the Second World War was the most highly mobile, mechanically reliable, and logistically sound force the world had ever seen. While a Soviet rifle division still relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons for tactical supply at the regimental level, the Americans moved exclusively on rubber tires and internal combustion engines. This meant the Allies could shift massive reserves across the theatre at speeds the Soviets could only dream of. It is highly reminiscent of the American Civil War, where the Union Army brilliantly utilized the rail network to rapidly redeploy entire corps-sized elements, completely outmaneuvering the less industrialized Confederacy. The Allied command structure was spearheaded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a master of coalition warfare, diplomacy, and massive logistical undertakings, generally favoring a broad front strategy to keep pressure on the enemy everywhere. But his subordinates were the aggressive tactical executioners who would fight the ground war. You had General George S. Patton, commanding the United States Third Army. Patton was the undisputed American master of maneuver warfare. He understood armored cavalry, operations, and operational tempo better than anyone in the Allied camp. He aggressively utilized combined arms, pushing his armored divisions at a breakneck pace, bypassing strongpoints to sever enemy supply lines. Opposite him in temperament, you had the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a cautious, meticulous, and methodical planner who relied on set-piece battles and overwhelming artillery preparation before moving an inch. The personal and professional friction between Patton and Montgomery is legendary. But in a desperate defensive war against a massive Soviet onslaught, Montgomery's distinct talent for organizing incredibly dense, layered anti-tank defenses would be absolutely vital to stopping the initial bleeding. The American armored fist was built primarily around the M4 Sherman medium tank. For decades, the Sherman has gotten a bad rap in pop culture as a death trap. But that is a persistent myth born from bad history and memoirs. The late model Shermans in 1945, particularly the M4A3E8, affectionately known as the Easy 8, were phenomenal, war-winning machines. They featured wet stowage systems to drastically reduce catastrophic ammunition fires, wide tracks for vastly improved mobility in the soft European mud, and high-velocity 76mm guns. When firing high-velocity armor-piercing or HVAP tungsten core rounds, a 76mm Sherman could punch right through heavy armor at standard combat ranges. The British brought their own modification to the fight, the Sherman Firefly, mounting a devastating 17-pounder anti-tank gun that could easily crack open an IS-2 or a Tiger tank. And crucially, the Americans were just starting to deploy the M26 Pershing in significant numbers. The Pershing was classified as a heavy tank by American standards, weighing in at 46 tons, and armed with a highly potent 90mm main gun. It was designed specifically to kill German big cats, and it would have been the primary American counter to the Soviet heavy armor battalions. When you look at the infantry squad level, the American GI held a distinct firepower advantage. The standard US infantry squad was built around 12 men, equipped with the M1 Garand. The Garand was a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle holding 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition. It allowed an American squad to put down a volume of accurate, sustained fire that was unmatched. The average Soviet infantryman was still carrying the Mosin Nagant, a 5-round bolt-action rifle dating back to the late 19th century, while the Soviets heavily issued the PPSH-41 submachine gun, which was absolutely devastating in urban room-to-room clearing operations. It fired a pistol cartridge and was virtually useless in an open field engagement at 300 yards. Furthermore, the American squad possessed the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, providing highly mobile suppressive fire. But the true equalizer on the ground was American artillery technology. While the Soviets had more guns, the Americans had a revolutionary technological edge. They utilized time-on-target, or TOT, barrages. This was a complex mathematical and communication system where multiple artillery batteries, located miles apart, would perfectly time their firing so that all their shells landed on the exact same target at the exact same millisecond. The enemy had absolutely no warning, no time to dive into their foxholes, and the ammunition they were firing was revolutionary. The Americans had developed the VT, or variable time, proximity fuse. This fuse contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver, built right into the nose of the artillery shell. Instead of relying on a mechanical timer, or exploding on impact, the proximity fuse would detonate the shell exactly 50 feet above the ground. This created a devastating airburst of high-velocity shrapnel that rained down into trenches and foxholes, shredding infantry in the open. General George Patton famously stated that the proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge. Against massive waves of attacking Soviet infantry, the VT fuse would have caused casualty rates that defy human comprehension. Yet, if the Allies were heavily outnumbered on the ground, they held the ultimate undeniable trump card in the sky. Allied air supremacy in 1945 was absolute and total. The United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force fielded a combined armada of over 28,000 combat aircraft in the European theatre. The Soviet Air Force, known as the VVS, was primarily designed and trained for low-level tactical support over the immediate battlefield. They flew thousands of heavily armoured Il-2 Sturmoviks, which were excellent platforms for strafing tanks and infantry. But they severely lacked high-altitude performance, advanced radar systems, and the pilot training required for complex air-to-air combat. The Allies possessed thousands of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt, affectionately known by its pilots as the Jug, was a 7-ton flying tank powered by a massive radial engine. It was armed with 850 caliber heavy machine guns and could carry a devastating payload of unguided rockets and high explosive bombs. It was the premier close air support aircraft of the entire war. If the Red Army tried to mass its armoured columns and supply convoys on the roads of Germany during a summer offensive, the Allied tactical air forces would turn those roads into a burning slaughterhouse. We saw exactly what happens when massive, unprotected armoured columns get caught in the open by uncontested American air power during the Highway of Death in the Gulf War. The P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons would have done to the Soviet Guards tank Kaim exactly what the A-10 Warthogs did to the Iraqi Republican Guard decades later. The skies would be completely owned by the Allies. And we absolutely cannot forget the strategic bombing campaign. The Allies had thousands of 4-engine heavy bombers ready to fly. Armadas of B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and British Avro Lancasters were sitting on airfields across England and France. The Soviets had virtually no strategic bomber force to speak of, and very limited primitive radar-directed air defense networks. The Allied heavy bombers could operate deep behind Soviet lines with near impunity. They would systematically obliterate Soviet rail yards, smash the vital bridges over the Oder and Vistula rivers, and incinerate the massive fuel depots required to keep the Red Army moving. Without a constant, uninterrupted flow of diesel, artillery shells, and replacement troops coming from the east, the massive Soviet offensive would inevitably grind to a halt under its own immense weight. Allied logistics were a marvel of modern industrial engineering. The famous Red Ball Express had already proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that American quartermasters could sustain a massive mechanized army on the move across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. They had secured and repaired the massive deep-water port of Antwerp, meaning millions of tons of supplies were flowing directly from the untouched factories of Detroit and Chicago, straight across the Atlantic, and right to the front lines. The American soldier was the best fed, best equipped, and best supplied infantryman in the history of human warfare. This overwhelming logistical superiority would form the absolute bedrock of the Allied defense against the Soviet tide. The stage is now set for a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The greatest clash of armor, artillery, and infantry the world has ever seen is no longer a theoretical exercise debated by staff officers. The final orders are cut and signed in Moscow. The encrypted code words are transmitted down the wire to the frontline Soviet commanders waiting in the forests of Germany. As the sun sets on the first week of July 1945, the eerie silence over the German plains is violently shattered by the deafening thunder of 10,000 artillery pieces firing in unison. The Red Army has crossed the line of departure. The earth literally liquefies under the concussive force of the Soviet opening bombardment. Millions of pounds of high explosives tear into the Allied defensive lines across the North German plain and the Fulda Gap, turning the summer morning into a choking, twilight hellscape of pulverized dirt and vaporized steel. The sheer density of the Red Army's artillery preparation is something the Western Allies have never experienced, not even during the worst days of the Battle of the Bulge. Entire grid squares are erased from the map by rolling barrages of 152mm howitzer fire and the screaming multi-launch salvos of BM-13 Katyusha rockets. The psychological shock is paralyzing, shattering eardrums and collapsing frontline bunkers. But as the dust settles and the rumble of diesel engines echoes through the smoke, the surviving American and British infantrymen dig out their weapons and prepare for the onslaught. This is where the Soviet doctrine of deep battle crashes headfirst into the American doctrine of overwhelming interlocking firepower. The initial Soviet assault is spearheaded by penal battalions and penal companies, the Strafbat, desperate men forced to march directly through active minefields to clear a path with their own bodies. Behind them comes the first echelon of regular Soviet motor rifle troops. They advance in massive, densely packed waves, firing their PP-41 submachine guns from the hip. The PP is a brutal weapon for trench clearing, spitting out 71 rounds of 7.62mm pistol ammunition from its drum magazine, at a blistering rate of 900 rounds per minute. But out in the open fields, at ranges exceeding 200 yards, it is horribly inaccurate. Waiting for them in defilade positions are the American heavy weapons companies. The cornerstone of the Allied infantry defense is the legendary M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. This weapon is an absolute masterpiece of lethal engineering. Weighing in at 84 pounds with its tripod, it fires a massive 800-grain armor-piercing incendiary projectile at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute. The kinetic energy of a 50 caliber round is so immense that it does not just kill a man. It physically dismembers him, tearing through tree trunks, sandbags, and the engine blocks of light armoured vehicles as if they were made of wet cardboard. Alongside the M2, the American lines are anchored by the M1919A4 30 caliber air-cooled machine gun. Gun crews are feeding 250-round fabric belts through the receivers so fast that the barrels begin to glow a dull cherry red in the early morning light, requiring the assistant gunners to use thick asbestos gloves to swap out the melting steel. You have to ask yourself, how do you hold your ground when a human tidal wave is rushing your foxhole and your own weapon is literally melting in your hands from sustained fire? You rely on the men to your left and right, and you rely on the artillery. The American response to the human wave is a masterclass in time-on-target artillery execution. Miles behind the front, batteries of 105mm and 155mm howitzers calculate the exact trajectories required to drop a curtain of steel directly in front of the advancing Soviet echelons. Utilizing the top-secret VT proximity fuses, the American shells do not impact the ground. They detonate exactly 50 feet in the air, projecting a conical shotgun blast of jagged, high-velocity shrapnel straight downward. The effect on the massed Soviet infantry in the open is catastrophic, mirroring the slaughter of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, but mechanized and multiplied by a factor of 1,000. Entire Soviet regiments are cut down in minutes, their advance shattered by an invisible roof of exploding steel. But the infantry is just the screening force. At Rue 600 hours, the ground begins to vibrate with a new, heavier frequency. The Guards' tank armies have arrived. Massive wedge formations of T-34-85 medium tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks crest the ridges, their wide tracks churning the German soil. The tactical challenge facing the Allied anti-tank gunners is monumental. The standard American infantry anti-tank weapon is the M9 bazooka. It fires a shaped-charge rocket utilizing the Monroe effect, meaning upon impact, a cone of high explosives detonates, driving a hypervelocity jet of superplastic copper straight through the enemy armor. On paper, it can penetrate the side armor of a T-34, but in the chaotic reality of a battlefield, the sloped, angled frontal glacis plate of the Soviet tanks means that if the bazooka rocket does not strike at the absolute perfect perpendicular angle, it simply deflects harmlessly off the hull, spinning wildly into the sky. To stop the Soviet armor, the Americans deploy their dedicated tank destroyer battalions. The M36 Jackson is the premier American tank killer of 1945. It is essentially a modified Sherman chassis mounting a massive, long-barreled 90mm M3 gun. This is the exact same anti-aircraft gun the Americans adapted to kill tanks, similar to how the Germans used their infamous 88mm flak gun. The Jackson can punch a hole straight through the thickest part of a Soviet IS-2 at over 1,000 yards. But the M36 has a fatal design flaw. To accommodate the massive breech of the 90mm gun and save weight for mobility, the turret is completely open-topped. The crew is exposed to the elements, and more importantly, they are completely unprotected from artillery airbursts and mortar shrapnel. As Soviet 120mm heavy mortars begin to register the American tank destroyer positions, the Jackson crews are forced to fight buttoned up under improvised canvas roofs, taking horrific casualties from top-down fragmentation. The armored clash devolves into a brutal, point-blank slugfest. The Soviet tactic is to overwhelm by sheer volume, rushing the American positions to get inside the minimum effective range of the heavy anti-tank guns. It is a terrifying mechanical brawl, reminiscent of the desperate armored holding actions during the initial days of the Korean War, where outgunned American task forces at the Pusan perimeter had to use mobility and terrain to delay massive columns of North Korean T-34s. The American M4A3E8 Shermans, the Easy 8s, utilize their superior gyroscopic gun stabilizers to fire on the move, darting out from behind ruined buildings and hedgerows, snapping off a 76mm high-velocity armor, piercing round into the vulnerable side flanks of the Soviet tanks, and immediately reversing back into cover before the heavy, slow-turning turrets of the IS-2s can track them. By 900 hours, the tactical situation on the ground is bending toward a breaking point. The sheer mass of the Soviet assault is pushing the Allied lines back, trading space for time, and leaving behind a landscape littered with burning steel and thousands of casualties. But as the morning fog burns off and the summer sun breaks through the overcast sky, a new sound fills the air. It is the deep, throaty roar of thousands of Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engines. The United States Army Air Forces have arrived. The sky is suddenly black, with P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons. This is the moment where Allied air supremacy fundamentally alters the geometry of the battlefield. The P-47 is a 7-ton flying tank, heavily armoured around the cockpit and the engine, capable of taking a 20mm anti-aircraft shell directly to a cylinder and still flying its pilot home. They dive out of the sun at over 400 miles per hour, unleashing salvos of 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, or HVRRs. These rockets carry a 50-pound high-explosive warhead, and when a flight of 4 Thunderbolts ripples their rockets into a concentrated Soviet armor column, the results are apocalyptic. 46-ton IS-2 tanks are flipped onto their turrets by the concussive blast waves. Following the rocket strikes, the fighter bombers drop napalm canisters. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture, splashes over the Soviet formations in a rolling tide of liquid fire that burns at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It seeps into the engine grills of the T-34s, instantly incinerating the engines and suffocating the crews inside, as the fire consumes all the oxygen in the immediate area. The Soviet advance columns are pinned down, burning on the highways, completely cut off from their rear echelon supply lines. This utilization of overwhelming close air support to isolate and destroy a massed enemy ground assault is exactly the same tactical doctrine the United States military would later use to break the siege of Khe Sanh in Vietnam, where air power alone shattered the back of the North Vietnamese Army's conventional divisions. Down on the ground, the battle for the high ground becomes a microscopic war of absolute savagery. Take the defense of Hill 412, overlooking a vital pontoon bridge across the Weser River. Elements of the American 3rd Armored Division's mechanized infantry are completely cut off and surrounded by a full regiment of Soviet Guards infantry. The fighting devolves from rifle fire to point-blank grenade duels. When the ammunition runs dry, American GIs draw their MM-19111 .45 caliber pistols, a heavy, stopping power weapon designed specifically for close-quarters trench raiding. When the pistols click empty, the fighting turns to entrenching tools, combat knives, and bare hands in the muddy craters. The Soviet infantrymen, fueled by vodka and the relentless orders of their political commissars, charge the hill in waves, stepping over the stacked bodies of their own comrades to reach the American foxholes. Are human courage and sheer stubbornness enough to hold a perimeter when you are outnumbered 10-1 and out of ammunition? For the men on Hill 412, the answer is written in blood. They hold the line for 6 agonizing hours, buying enough time for the combat engineers behind them to wire the Weser River Bridge with hundreds of pounds of TNT and blow it into the sky. denying the Soviet armor a crucial crossing point. But despite the heroic defensive stands, despite the unprecedented slaughter inflicted by American artillery, and despite the absolute dominance of the fighter bombers in the sky, the Soviet Juggernaut is still grinding westward. The Red Army is taking unimaginable losses, trading 50 tanks for every one American tank destroyed. But Stalin has the strategic depth and the ruthless willpower to absorb those casualties. The Allied front line is slowly fracturing under the sheer, unyielding pressure of millions of men and thousands of armored vehicles. The logistical umbilical cord of the Red Army is stretching, but it has not yet snapped. General Eisenhower and the Allied High Command realize that tactical victories and holding actions will not win this war of attrition. They need a strategic masterstroke, a weapon of such terrifying, unprecedented, destructive power that it will instantly vaporize the Soviet command structure and sever their supply lines in a single blinding flash. That strategic masterstroke was already sitting in the heavily guarded bomb bays of the 509th Composite Group, waiting on the tarmac of a classified airfield. We are talking about the culmination of the Manhattan Project, the most expensive and secretive scientific endeavor in human history. To understand the sheer gravity of this moment, you have to look at the delivery system itself, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This was not just an airplane, it was a technological marvel that actually cost the American taxpayer more to develop than the atomic bomb itself. The B-29 was a pressurized, high-altitude heavy bomber powered by 4 massive Wright R-3T-350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each churning out 2,200 horsepower. It featured a revolutionary central fire control system with remote-controlled machine gun turrets, operated by gunners using analog computers to calculate lead and bullet drop. It was designed to fly in the thin, freezing air at 30,000 feet, far above the effective ceiling of most Soviet interceptors and their primitive anti-aircraft artillery. The target would not be a sprawling metropolis like Moscow, which was too far out of range and too heavily defended by rings of flak. The target would be the absolute linchpin of the Soviet war machine, the massive rail yards and logistical hubs in Eastern Europe. Imagine a city like Warsaw or Brest-Litovsk, where the broad-gauge railways of the Soviet Union met the standard-gauge railways of Europe. This was the massive bottleneck where thousands of tons of diesel fuel, artillery shells, and replacement troops had to be manually transferred to keep the Red Army offensive alive. At exactly 008 Funvive hours, a lone B-29, stripped of its defensive armor to save weight and maximize altitude, releases a 10,000-pound plutonium implosion device over the target. The bomb, a twin to the Fat Man device dropped on Nagasaki, falls for 43 seconds. Inside the casing, a sphere of conventional high explosives detonates with perfect microsecond symmetry, compressing a core of plutonium-239 to supercriticality. The resulting explosion is not just a bigger bomb, it is a fundamental altering of physics on the battlefield. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns sears the retinas of anyone looking in its direction for 20 miles. A fireball burning at tens of thousands of degrees Fahrenheit instantly vaporizes the massive steel bridges, the train cars, and thousands of Soviet soldiers. The overpressure wave, moving faster than the speed of sound, crushes heavily armored IS-2 tanks like empty beer cans and flattens every structure within a 2-mile radius. Then comes the mushroom cloud, a terrifying pillar of radioactive ash rising 40,000 feet into the stratosphere, casting a dark, toxic shadow over the burning ruins of the logistical hub. How does a military force, built entirely on the concept of mass, momentum, and centralized command, react when an entire army group and its lifeline simply cease to exist in a fraction of a second? The answer is total, paralyzing operational shock. The doctrine of deep battle, which Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev had perfected, relied on concentrating massive amounts of armor and men at a specific breakthrough point. In the atomic age, that concentration of force goes from being your greatest strength to being a fatal vulnerability. This introduces a paradigm shift in military strategy that is just as absolute and bloody as the introduction of the Maxim machine gun during the First World War. Just as the machine gun made the massed infantry charges of the Somme suicidal, the atomic bomb makes the massed armored columns of the Red Army obsolete overnight. You can no longer pack 300 tanks into a staging area without risking a single American bomber wiping them all out before they even cross the line of departure. With their primary rail hubs vaporized and highly radioactive, the Soviet logistical umbilical cord is completely severed. This is where we must shift our focus from the blinding flash of the atomic bomb to the agonizing, slow-motion death of the Soviet supply lines. Without the mass influx of American Lend-Lease trucks, and with their rail network shattered, the Red Army is suddenly stranded in the middle of a hostile, ruined continent. The massive fuel depots required to feed the V-12 diesel engines of the T-34 tanks run dry. Soviet tank crews are forced to abandon their pristine, heavily armored fighting vehicles on the sides of the German autobahns, spiking the main guns and blowing the breaches so they cannot be captured. This logistical strangulation draws a direct historical parallel to the Anaconda Plan of the American Civil War. In the 1860s, the industrialized Union did not just defeat the Confederacy on the battlefield, they threw a naval blockade around the southern ports and systematically destroyed their rail infrastructure, slowly starving the Confederate war machine of raw materials and ammunition, until it simply collapsed from within. General Eisenhower and the Allied High Command are executing a mechanized 20th century version of that exact same strategy. They are utilizing absolute air supremacy and strategic bombing to put a chokehold on the Soviet rear echelons. As the Soviet advance grinds to a halt, the war mutates into a multi-dimensional conflict, expanding far beyond the front lines into the realm of espionage, covert operations, and political warfare. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, under the command of General William Wild Bill Donovan, shifts its vast network of spies and saboteurs from targeting the Nazis to targeting the NKVD and the Soviet occupation forces. The OSS begins flying modified C-47 Skytrains at night, dropping thousands of tons of weapons, explosives, and encrypted radios to anti-communist partisan groups behind Soviet lines. Groups like the Polish Home Army and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, who had just spent years fighting a brutal underground war against the Gestapo, instantly turn their guns on the Red Army. They blow up the remaining rail lines, ambush isolated Soviet truck convoys, and assassinate political commissars. The Soviet rear area becomes a bleeding ulcer, requiring Stalin to pull hundreds of thousands of frontline combat troops back just to secure his own supply lines against relentless guerrilla attacks. From an economic perspective, the disparity between the two superpowers becomes the ultimate deciding factor. In 1945, the United States mainland was touched by the ravages of war. The American industrial base is a roaring, unstoppable behemoth. Factories in Detroit and Chicago are churning out a new Sherman tank every few hours, and shipyards are launching Liberty ships faster than the enemy could ever hope to sink them. The American gross domestic product has doubled during the war years. Contrast this with the Soviet Union. Their economy is on life support. The western half of their country, their primary agricultural and industrial heartland, was systematically burned to the ground during the German invasion and the subsequent Soviet counter-offensive. They have lost 27 million citizens, meaning their labor pool is completely exhausted. They are drafting teenagers and old men to work 12-hour shifts in the freezing factories of the Ural Mountains, producing weapons from dwindling stockpiles of raw materials. Once the American Lend-Lease spigot is turned off, the Soviet economy begins to cannibalize itself. They simply do not have the industrial stamina to sustain a prolonged high-intensity conflict against the combined economic might of the United States and the British Empire. Politically, President Harry S. Truman is playing a high-stakes game of global poker. He knows the American public is deeply war-weary. The mothers and fathers of America want their boys brought home from Europe, not sent into another meat grinder against a former ally. But Truman also understands the geopolitical reality of the 20th century. If he allows Stalin to conquer Western Europe, the Soviet Union will control the industrial capacity of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, making them an unstoppable global hegemon. Truman leans heavily on the Pearl Harbor mentality, framing the Soviet invasion as a treacherous, unprovoked betrayal of the free world. The deployment of the atomic bomb serves a dual purpose. It is a tactical weapon to halt the Red Army, but it is also a massive psychological weapon aimed directly at Joseph Stalin's paranoia. It demonstrates that the United States possesses a weapon of absolute destruction, and more importantly, that the American president has the ruthless political will to actually use it. Stalin, sitting in the Kremlin, is forced to look at a strategic map that has turned completely against him. His elite guards' tank armies are bogged down, out of fuel, and being systematically dismantled by American tactical air power. His supply lines are radioactive craters or infested with Western-backed partisans. His cities are now under the constant, terrifying threat of atomic annihilation from a fleet of B-29 bombers that his air force cannot intercept. The brutal calculus of survival, which has guided Stalin his entire life, dictates that he must cut his losses. The Soviet invasion of Western Europe does not end with a triumphant march into Paris or a glorious final battle. It ends with a sudden, localized ceasefire, brokered through back-channel diplomats in neutral Switzerland. The resulting armistice redraws the map of the world in blood and radiation. The Iron Curtain does not fall across the middle of Germany, as it did in our timeline. It is pushed much further east, likely to the pre-war borders of Poland, leaving a devastated, heavily militarized buffer zone in between. Europe is left in ruins, completely dependent on the American Marshall Plan for survival, while the United States cements its position as the undisputed, solitary superpower of the globe. The conflict proves that raw manpower and aggressive doctrine, no matter how vast or ruthless, cannot overcome overwhelming industrial supremacy, uncontested control of the airspace, and the terrifying dawn of the nuclear age. War is often described as a continuation of politics by other means. But when the means involve the splitting of the atom and the vaporization of entire armies, politics ceases to exist, leaving only the cold arithmetic of survival. Now, I want to hear your command decision in the comments below. If you were the Supreme Allied Commander in 1945, facing a massive Soviet invasion, what would be your primary strategy to halt the Red Army? A. Conduct a fighting retreat and rely entirely on massive atomic strikes to decapitate Soviet logistics. B. Launch massive amphibious flanking invasions in the Baltic and Black Seas to stretch Soviet forces. Or C. Dig in for a brutal, conventional war of attrition, utilizing overwhelming tactical air power and proximity-fused artillery. Drop your strategic analysis in the comments, defend your position, and make sure you are subscribed for the next briefing.